It's hard to imagine a painter as concrete as Caravaggio working for this feeble creature, but a job was a job, and besides, the Cavaliere had connections. At some point during Caravaggio's first years in the city, an Englishman arrived here, a young pamphleteer named Thomas Nash, who in 1597 published a splendid picaresque novel based upon his own wanderings about Europe, called The Unfortunate Traveller, and it's still not by any means the worst of guides to Caravaggio's Rome. Italy, the paradise of the earth and the epicure's haven, how doth it form our young master? It makes him to kiss the hand like an ape, to cringe his neck like a starveling, and to play at hey, pass, repass, come aloft when he salutes a man, and from hence he brings the art of epicurizing, the art of atheism, the art of whoring, and the art of sodometry. Granted, Nash had all the Elizabethan bigotry against Italy, that land of Romish Machiavels, but about its pecking order, he was absolutely right. No artist had any chance of success, or even, in fact, very much of survival, unless he managed to turn himself in some degree into a courtier, attaching himself to one of the great families of Rome with their houses like Palazzo Spada here, or Palazzo Doria Pamphili, Palazzo Barberini, or Palazzo Farnese. At first, this world of the big commissions was closed to Caravaggio. His earliest known paintings are modest, single figures, still lives, like the so-called Sick Bacchus, which probably was a self-portrait done after a bout of malaria, which we know that he went to a Rome hospital to recover from. The flesh is rather fuzzy and inert, and the drawing of the figure is capable but routine so far. But though he doesn't handle animate forms so well, Caravaggio is precocious with still life. He gives you the full density and presence of every fruit in that basket, the ripeness of the peaches, the bloom on the grapes, the springy curve of the vine leaf stalks. In the process, he became one of the first artists to turn still life into a type of painting, and so begin the tradition that would run on through Chardin to Georges Braque. He took an object, and he made it a subject, distinct, specific, against a neutral backdrop, nothing else to look at. Now, at the end of the 16th century, the supreme test and subject for the artist was the human figure. Still life, what a connoisseur called the ability to reproduce flowers and similar trifles, was at the very bottom of the painter's hierarchy. But not for Caravaggio. There was, he declared, no difference at all between a figure and a leaf. Both were equally demanding, each needed tanta manifattura, the same degree of handiwork.
Whether you paint a flower or a human figure, you have to devote the same amount of good work.
But the young painter also had to learn his anatomy if he was to compete with the rest of the artists in Rome. Giovanni Baglione, who wrote a series of lives of his fellow painters, which are better remembered than his own paintings, commented rather patronizingly.
He also made a boy bitten by a lizard, which had appeared from a thicket of flowers and fruits, and truly the boy's head looked as it was shrieking, and the whole composition was diligently worked out.
There were social lessons too. He must learn to dance attendance upon lords and papal princes, because the free art market for living artists, as we understand it today, the system of dealers and galleries, had really only just begun to come into existence at the start of the 17th century. Therefore, you needed a patron, somebody who'd collect your work and fix you up with introductions to the relevant monsignori so that you could get church commissions, and in general, plug you in some way into Roman society on however menial a level. And in return, you could be expected to do just about anything from painting to pimping. Now, curiously enough, despite his ruinously evil temper, Caravaggio never lacked patrons of this sort. The consumers of art liked him right from the first. It was only the connoisseurs that felt slightly nervous about his formal innovations. His problem, therefore, was never rejection, but rather a ruinous incapacity to behave like the success that he really was. Caravaggio was only 24 when, in 1595, he met his first Maecenas, the man whose tastes were to do so much to shape his own early imagery. He was a prince of the church, no less, and a close friend of Pope Clement VIII. He had a vast palace near Piazza Navona and almost unlimited funds at his disposal, and his name was Cardinal Francisco Maria del Monte. The Cardinal was in his mid-40s and the occupant of this palace when he met Caravaggio. He was one of the most enlightened collectors in Rome and one of its more heroic pederasts. Palazzo Madama, where he gave lavish drag balls in the 1590s, has since become, by a certain irony, the headquarters of the Roman Senate. Caravaggio took up his lodging there in 1596, and he settled down to painting what the Cardinal liked. His taste seems, on the whole, not to have varied. A round, fleshy face framed by a pompadour of curly hair like black whipped cream, opaque eyes, an expression of sweet, libidinous dumbness. One of Caravaggio's images was so very androgynous that it was miscatalogued for centuries. This lute player, now in the Hermitage. From Bellori in the 17th century to Bernard Berenson in the 20th, it was thought to be a girl, which of course it is not. Caravaggio painted it for the Cardinal del Monte in 1596, remarking when he'd finished that it was the best thing that he'd ever done. And in detail, one can see why. The still life on the table, as one of his contemporaries remarked, is exquisitely counterfeited, right down to the last drop of condensation and the last bit of light on the musical instrument. Other commissions came from the Cardinal's friends, like the Marchese Giustiniani, who had him do this painting of Victoria's love. A prudish German friend named von Sandrart urged the Marchese, who owned 13 other Caravaggios, to hang this one behind a curtain. And one can see why, because it's the triumph of sex over culture. A very unideal young Cupid, fresh off the piazza, clambering out of bed with a raunchy grin on his face. He's trampling on a whole litter of objects which symbolise the disciplines of mind and imagination that Giustiniani, that eminent humanist, so conspicuously valued when in the salon. Architecture, the square and compasses, music, the score, the violin and the lute, and even the armour symbolising military glory. The last time that this sexual type got centre stage in Caravaggio's work was in this picture here in the Uffizi in Florence. It's very elaborate, very highly finished, and in fact a presentation piece. It's the same plump, heavy-lidded catamite that Caravaggio had painted so many times before for the Cardinal del Monte, and probably, in fact, he existed in real life. What we're probably looking at is the Cardinal's favourite boyfriend, but this time tricked out in the mythological drag appropriate to Bacchus, the god of wine and orgy. What an oppressive picture it is. It exudes the same kind of hothouse feeling as some portraits by Ingres 2.5 centuries later, those sleek, plump Second Empire pleasure machines with their tropical hands. But Caravaggio was in his 20s, and of course he couldn't draw as well as Ingres, and certainly he was having trouble with that peculiarly coarse line of the shoulder there. But never mind, because the fascinating thing about this picture is the extent to which Caravaggio took over the existing stereotypes for painting a desirable female nude, say of Venus, and applied them to a man. This person is nothing other than an object. He offers himself to your gaze with a kind of lustful passivity tinged with sarcasm. Seen it all, done it all. There's nothing heroic about him at all. He's a long way from the classical Renaissance nude. And instead, you have these rather coarse proletarian muscles run to seed in the palace. The body exists in exactly the same way as the still life does. It's a flawed object among other objects, slightly too ripe, rather too soft. And the painting, in fact, that this most reminds me of was painted almost 300 years later by another great realist, Edouard Manet, and it is, of course, the Olympia, a portrait of a